the second research event, which had been conducted in the first week of November, and as a consequent endeavour in conjunction with the first research event, gave us the opportunity to carry out a Deleuzian reading of the interactions, the relations, connections, flows, material discursive entanglements that co-constituted this framework. So, as we know that the Deleuzian analysis, what it does at heart, is bring into account the elements that traditional psychoanalysis could not, namely it brings into account an active element of historical materialism and de-center the Anthropocene. So we see that in the slide here, a murmuration of birds, to look at the possibilities, I suppose, of other ways of perceiving, say, the entanglements and a sort of radical poetics of it all. And there is also laden in this analysis, as opposed to traditional psychoanalysis, a feminist ethic of care, and that we have been talking about throughout the research procedure, and again in terms of what has co-constituted it. So one that is inherently decolonial, but especially so when taking into account also the intersectional element to our research procedures, which is of epicentral importance, also in terms of materially defining the categories, the research categories that we have been looking at, women belonging to migrant backgrounds, to less financially, socially, culturally disadvantaged backgrounds, less advantaged backgrounds. And what we're saying here is that the connections between the intersectional and decolonial feminist praxis of care has been sort of embodied by the Deleuzian analysis conducted. So this has been divided categorically for ease of access and understanding in 5 parts. So there are relations and connections in terms of who or what connects with whom or what, how those connections appear, how they intensify, how they weaken, how they reroute, flows of affect and intensity, and again politics of affect is a sort of defining criteria in terms of both the analysis and our research praxis and the research paradigm. So this affective charge that have been observed, uptake, hesitation, resonance, through laughter, through silence, other forms of affective exchange. And then we have material discursive entanglements in terms of, again, centering the research subjects, the human research subjects in the room, but also connecting them with how objects, technology, the architecture, the language enact and reconfigure those relations. The third category is micropowers and tactics, so the subtle coordinations, the whispers that Freudian methods of studying it have often missed out on, the interventions, collaborations, the refusals, very, very liminally, something that often escapes the eye if it's not being looked into. And the fifth category is lines of flight and deterritorialization. So we look at ruptures, we look at unexpected innovations, and this is where the abductive part of the research paradigm comes in. We are expecting the unexpected, So there are moments when those practices depart from said norms. In terms of the first category then, we have observed certain things out of which these statements and interpretations have stood out. One being that bridges don't exist. And I suppose it's been said in a sense that that is both materialist and metaphorical and psychological at the same time, bringing in assemblage again as a way of rerouting, but also as a way of looking at this, and the two of them kind of cross-pollinating and feeding into one another. So not afraid to approach political spaces, but the women think that they don't exactly exist in the first place. To start with, we'll be looking into other comments that relate to those statements in the later stages. There's also interlinguistic exchange that had been observed and spontaneous translation of statements. And as we see in Deleuzian analysis, there's great emphasis laid on difference against repetition and what constitutes it, again, in the first place, and what constitutes it in terms of movement, in terms of motion. So here in the second category, in terms of flows of affect and intensity, we had observed that oftentimes the women had felt that they couldn't step out. So there were recurrent thoughts, feelings, interpretations of claustrophobia, of home, of spaces that were predetermined for them, and letting go of chains, of fetters, of household chores or other barriers, other material barriers that were forbidding them from political participation. And there were smiles and non-verbal cues and hums expressed to convey solidarity, but also to convey the lack of spaces to carry out those solidarity or wield them into perhaps policies, into perhaps other modes of material change that actually had been translated into real life actions. Also to talk about the more negative forces that were shaping, that continue to shape flows of affect, including implicit forms of racism. Somebody made a statement about the racism in our heads, so much like Deleuzian scholars talk about in the fascism in our heads. So anti-immigrant sentiments being on the rise, a lack of opportunities and resources that allow access for migrant women's participation in politics. So that those statements again feed into a paradigm where we're looking at affect as a politics of space, and politics of affect as a politics of space, and claiming that space. So there's invisible barriers that are often present, which are material, which are tactile, but also metaphorical, also somewhat abstract, and oftentimes, again, not visible to the naked eye, stopping one from speaking, such as, again, to name a few examples, there's implicit racism, implicit forms of anti-migrant sentiments, implicit forms of patriarchal violence that is normalized, that has become part of everyday life practice and has remained so through the ethos of history, and conviviality, joy, sarcasm, laughter, on a more positive note, ridicule, used as political tools and tools of creative self-expression. So the third category, where we look at material discursive entanglements, we see that there's a lack of representation, and again, material lack in terms of the drawings that were provided. So there was desire for more anti-hegemonic modes of communication, or expanding the limits of what was permissible as a form of communication, invisibilization of material barriers as an active process. Particularly those concerned with temporal spatial agency and accessibility to the women. And again, the 21st century, perhaps that's what agency and accessibility, well, there might have always been through the course of history, particularly now, in this day and age, that might be of greater importance than ever to have agency over time and space, sitting in the midst of the attention economy. In terms of micropowers and tactics, there was an emphasis, again recurrent, in terms of there being a necessity for greater collective action, something that I wanted to capture through the murmuration of the birds there in the first slide. The spontaneous emergence of leadership in context of conversations towards dialogue on anti-migrant sentiments, racism, schooling, interreligious faith, political systems. So again, this amalgamation of several different categories of everyday life experience and the institutions and non-institutional spaces that cross-pollinate with each other to create this dialogue amongst them. And I suppose in this context, the barriers emerge from the negative sort of dialogues exchanged within what has been listed there. There's also an element of collaboration in terms of collective meaning making within the room during the second and first research events, in terms of the spontaneous translations, again, the non-verbal cues shared, and other methods of conveying lived experience in this context. There's an emphasis on soft power, particularly on the feminist ethic of care that has been talked about, but also on material collective action and effective forms of solidarity in contrast to physical prowess or dominance. And in terms of the last and perhaps most interesting category then, we are looking at lines of flight and deterritorialization. Particularly, we're looking at rupture. We're looking at, the against claustrophobia chapter in terms of the fetters and chains that we were talking about a couple minutes ago. So one thing that's quite positive is that there is desire for ambition, but what is lacking is opportunities. The fear is not exactly about stepping into political spaces. The fear is about the lack of material resources. The barrier is literally about those resources not being there. And there was a statement made in connection to people being heard but not exactly listened to. So I think that is also, there's been recurrent connotations made in that regard, like speaking to a wall, there being a wall beside the words that were being said. So, it's another form of claustrophobia, I suppose. And there is an emphasis on accessibility and production of more resources and deeper time that allows sustenance of policies, as well as the assumptions, the thoughts, the cognitive procedures that drive positive material change in a democratic way, if it may. And the change in paper does not exactly account for lived experience in positive terms, and it hasn't to date materialized into either policy or action that, again, there is desire and ambition for, but what is lacking is opportunities. Thank you. That brings us to the end of the first Deleuzian analysis that has been conducted on the research events. Through the course of the upcoming events, the analysis is going to be refined further, and we would like the opportunity to share it with the group at that stage. Thanks again.